no longer exists as a person. Aborigines have been subject for this 200 years to a shocking sequence of interventions, a sequence that starts with their classification as fauna, as non-humans, by terra nullius, that moves through genocide, through assimilation, eventually, and not until 1967, to the recognition of their human existence and citizenship. And now, after that, a very complex legal battle of land rights and assertions, which we'll get on to later on in the talk. This evening I split the talk into two sections. The first, which will deal with some conceptual issues raised by the intervention of European ideas into Aboriginal culture and Aboriginal space. The second, questions of ethics in practice today. What a design professional or anyone else intervening into the spatiality of Australia should do ethically against this complex background. And that, of course, is an immensely difficult issue. I will use some examples, and they're examples which I think we will argue about. And in the seminar tomorrow, I will be using also film made by Aboriginal people about the concept of their space, which is translated into English and is used as part of a way of trying to develop some discussion and is a deeply, in my mind, a deeply ethical piece of material. This is difficult ground. Last week, Chantal Mouffe argued for the importance of ethics rather than morality in the political, and against the falseness of a universalizing rational consensus. She claimed, and I agree with her, that democracy has to come to terms with the inevitable fact of antagonism, of disharmony, of forms of exclusion, rather than trying to hide them through morality and rationality. This is a difficult process, to develop a politics grounded on ethics. Perhaps particularly difficult in Australia's case because of its history of invasion, of abusing international law, and of the political system's exclusion of Aboriginal people. Here is an extreme of alterity and of exclusion. Here is straight antagonism, as well as the clash of incompatible ideas of space, time, and ownership. Ethics, of course, do not operate in abstract, but only in relation to a framework of ideas shared within or between cultures. When two fundamentally different cultures meet, they are unlikely to mix. One can judge them by their own ethical standards, but in relating to each other, right and wrong become difficult to negotiate. In the case of Australia, there has been explicitly unethical practice by British colonisers in their own terms, but also a process of eradication of the other's culture, both intentionally and subliminally, a process which is not so clearly unethical. And that's, I think, a very important issue which I want to expand in the seminar tomorrow, exactly where one can draw the line of intentionality within an ethical debate. To start, I thought it would be perhaps helpful for people who don't know Australia to establish a little bit of the context of land and of the people. So I've got a small group of slides which I will use just to tune you in a little bit to the space of the land. Australia is very old land with a very fragile ecology, settled by humans between 100,000 and 60,000 years ago, who began to radically alter the ecology through nomadic cycles of intervention, the fire culture, and hunting. These people are the longest continuous human settlement on Earth. They were future eaters, to use the concept of Tim Flannery, the paleontologist who wrote a very significant book of that title. He used that concept for Homo sapiens, not just in Australia but all over the planet. Looking back over the fossil and living record of flora and fauna of 100 million years since the Australian continent split off from Gondwana, the supercontinent, his thesis is that humans progressively destroy the conditions for a sustainable future. The first Australians, arriving from Asia at least 60,000 years ago, were not passive, noble savages. They actively modified their environment. But they remained a small population and had cultural laws about not overexploiting any area of their nomadic territory. What appeared to European colonizers 200 years ago as a natural landscape was in fact a carefully managed ecology which these first future eaters were consuming only very slowly. European intervention brought rapid physical and cultural changes. Flannery concludes that unless Australia's population is stabilised around the present 17.5 million, unlike the populate and perish programs of recent governments, which have been encouraging massive increase in population, and unless it is dispersed from its present intense urban patterns, Australia will soon become completely unsustainable in an ecological sense. To survive, he argues, Homo sapiens in Australia, as elsewhere, must have a much better understanding and a fuller contact with its ecosystem. Particularly, in Australia's case, the understanding of fire management, long practiced by Aborigines and only just beginning now to be understood by ecologists on the continent. This type of landscape is not wild. It's actually carefully modified through cycles of fire, which coincide with climatic cycles of wet and dry. Territory like this becomes burnt out by managed fire, which clears the brush, which allows easier hunting, and which now, after such a long period, the flora have adapted to it and will not germinate unless the fire goes through. So the seeds are actually germinated through the process of fire, and you get these extraordinary scenes. This is just one day after the fire has gone through. The ground is still steaming, and plants immediately spring into life. Now, of course, the white settlers arriving had no knowledge of and no comprehension of this management of the land, and unknowingly have massively intervened in it. I'll go back to images later on because I want to use images to try to discuss how the culture uses what we would call art to demonstrate its relationships in space. And so I'll be using images later, but for the moment it's probably more comfortable for you and certainly more comfortable for me to have the lights on so I can see what I'm doing. The first stage, just to fill in a bit of history, and I'll try and go very rapidly on this, is to deal with the process of invasion. In 1788, the first British colonists arrived in Sydney, just over 200 years ago. And they began the process of exploration and settlement. In spite of documentation by Captain Cook and other explorers of an extensive Aboriginal culture, the British government declared Australia terra nullius, empty land. They offered no treaty to the Aborigines, and indeed, through international law, hoped to deny their existence. Because of problems at home, they were desperate to settle a new colony, and perhaps hoped it was far enough away that their illegality would not be challenged. This ownership claim was unethical in their terms, those of Western culture, and simply not conceivable in Aboriginal terms. Ownership of land is a fundamental of European culture and to all colonial expansion. It now dominates the world landmass, as you probably know. Every piece of the world's land is now owned by a sovereign state, except for Antarctica. Antarctica is a very bizarre situation where there was a big fight in the 1950s. 7 different countries could not agree, and there was an international treaty, as there is for the oceans, to split Antarctica as a protectorate of 7 countries. But ownership is fundamental. All other parts of the world are owned in our terms. Ownership implies rights and duties, but colonial history shows a strong tendency to exploit rights and to ignore duties. Aboriginal culture, on the other hand, has a completely different concept of ownership, which is difficult to explain, and I think through the images later it may become clearer. One way to try to sum it up is evidence given to a land rights tribunal that I was part of about 10 years ago, where one of the Aboriginal women in the group, in frustration eventually to the judge, said, "You think you can own land, we think the land owns us." She was trying to explain a very different relationship. There was no concept in Aboriginal culture of taking, of owning the land. You're part of a system in which the land responds to the humans and vice versa. 18th century culture, though not justifying the false claim of terra nullius, would, however, have supported a moral principle, and this is where the difference becomes interesting. Their moral principle would be that this land was not being used to its full potential, and so that the British were legitimate in settling it and in developing it. So that's a very different issue, that the land was, as it were, fallow and could be exploited, therefore. Successive European writings and actions have tried to eradicate Aboriginal space and culture, both explicitly and implicitly. And only recently, really only in the last 20 years, has this been significantly questioned in any political sense. Some phases of this history are the phase of being fauna. As I said, the Aboriginal people became wards of state, not humans, as fauna under terra nullius. The worst, at best they were protected, at worst they were vermin to be eradicated, and they were hunted as vermin during the 18th and early 19th century. They also, for a brief stage in this early period, became anthropological objects, objects of curiosity, and this is another theme that recycles through this history. The second stage in the 19th century was one of genocide and of the dispossession of land. The genocide was both covert, and there are many instances of that, but also condoned by the authorities. With exploration, of course, the squatters, illegal settlers, began to start land grabs without government control. And the British government became very worried about this. They wished to control and own the land. In the 1830s, they introduced pastoral leases in an attempt to regulate the colonists' settlement of the land. And significantly, and this is an indication that the British government by then felt that there was both politically and ethically a necessity to do so, included in the concept of pastoral leases is that Aborigines have a right to cohabit and have native title. And this later on becomes very significant in land rights battles. Henry Reynolds, a very important historian of this work in Australia, wrote a book called The Law of the Land, has researched this and discovered that while the Australian authorities were very pragmatic about genocide, it did raise ethical questions in London. Earl Grey, at the Colonial Office in the 1850s, sent instructions to Australian governors reminding them of human rights and of the responsibilities of imperial governments. These were largely ignored. The next phase in the early 20th century was one of assimilation. The mood changed to the sense of trying to gently absorb the remnants of the fading Australian culture, Aboriginal culture. In the 1950s, this becomes more aggressive because they don't fade, they don't disappear, they remain as a continuous nagging worry on the streets of the expanding cities. And so the government establishes what is laughably known as the Aboriginal Protection Board. Protection takes the form of removing children from Aboriginal families. More than 200,000 children are forcibly taken from their families and put into protection, normally mission stations, where they're given basic training so as to become useful as servants within the white economy. There is a recycling at this point also of the anthropological fascination, because there's a discovery from our terms, a discovery by white anthropologists in the 1950s of what is deemed to be a very important site. This is at Obiri Rock in Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory, a sacred site of the Gagajou people. And it has paintings which could be dated by the latest techniques in the 60s back beyond 40,000 years. And this shocked the world. This was older than the great paintings discovered at Lascaux in France, and far more sophisticated in their technique. And Obiri became a sort of symbol of the new anthropological sort of honouring of Aboriginal people, and indeed is now a World Heritage Site, much to the annoyance of many Aboriginal groups. As I will discuss later on, this concept of legitimation through temporal history, in other words, older is better, is more legitimate. So if you've got something 40,000 years old, goodness me, you must be important. This is completely alien in Aboriginal culture. There is no such concept of temporality giving legitimacy. The final stage, or the stage that we're currently in, is one that could be labelled citizenship. Only in 1967 did an embarrassed Australian government finally get forced to put a referendum to the Australian people as to whether the difficult status of Aborigines should be resolved. They were forced to do so, and in 1967, 90% of the electorate that voted for legislation to give Aboriginal people citizenship. So after almost 200 years, at least that stage, although the terra nullius problem was not confronted, they refused to deal with that, they did at least grant citizenship. Since then, as some of you may know through the papers and other recent work with Aboriginal artifacts in this country, there's been a long series of legal challenges of attempting to establish some sort of basis of negotiation between the two cultures. Aborigines beginning to realise that they have to fight Australian law with Australian law. You can't attempt to do it from your own cultural base, you have to do it from the dominant culture's base. The first really significant shift was the government elected in 1972, which included in its manifesto the statement, and I quote, "Our treatment of the Aboriginal people is the litmus test of our dedication to justice, peace and equality in the world. By our conduct in this area, the world will judge us." And for that, Gough Whitlam, who was the Prime Minister, amongst other sins he did, was summarily removed from office, and the very bizarre situation of the Queen's governor in Australia actually abandoned and dissolved that government. It was an extraordinary constitutional situation, but not one entirely sparked by the situation of Aboriginality. Later on, there have been significant legal cases, and I won't go through them today. The one you may have heard of is the Mabo judgment in 92, which actually at last in the High Courts overturned terra nullius. So that concept has now been eradicated. This is very interesting in its effects. The average white Australian was immediately terrified. They thought there would be swarms of Aborigines coming in, taking their barbecue areas and demanding land rights in their backyards. On the other side, from the Aborigines, they realised very quickly that although the High Court had overturned terra nullius, the effect of that in terms of legally being able to shift the rights to land was very small. And so the battle continues with dissatisfaction on both sides. So that's just to sketch in the background to what I really want to deal with today, which is why and how these ontologies, these senses of being of the two cultures coexisted for so long and have been quite unable to find a way of linking. Although there are some signs of linking, and in the final part, if I get time, I shall show what I believe to be some ethical practices, which we can then discuss in more detail tomorrow. From the beginning of European settlement, it has imposed not only its force, but its conceptual structures onto Aboriginal culture. The fictional voice of white history has attempted to rewrite the multidimensional history of Aboriginal space. This is not a clear ethical issue. It is not surprising that there is misrepresentation of such different cultures. This may be ethnocentrism, it may be racism, but at root it is not unethical, it is the failure to share an ontology. As several recent scholars have shown, notably Paul Carter, who wrote a fascinating book called The Road to Botany Bay, and Tony Swain, who wrote A Place for Strangers, as they have been discussing, Aborigines do not understand their being in terms of time, like the Western mind, but in terms of place and space. Aboriginal law and interpretive tradition is spatial, not temporal. In this sense, Aboriginal history only starts with European discovery and invasion. The clock, as it were, begins to tick. And indeed, until the 1960s, Aborigines are non-existent in Australian history. What Stanner, one of the great historians in Australia in the 1960s, called the Great Australian Silence. Australian history was constructed and written as a white history, a history of colonial achievement. In Aboriginal culture, authentic dating and chronology is not important. Time flows in a different way, and there have been endless attempts to try to describe this, and I think that no European, however closely they've worked and spent time with Aborigines, can describe it, although one senses it in spending a lot of time with Aboriginal people, a completely different sense of the way that time works. Elkin, A.P. Elkin, a very distinguished anthropologist in the 1930s and 40s, who lived for a long time with Aborigines in the Central Desert, tried to explain it in this way, and I quote, "But what is time? To us it is a series of then and now, the now almost immediately becoming then. To the Aborigines, however, it appears, time is now, then is a past, but a past, however, that is present here and now. There isn't the cutting off, the shifting between then and now." Many commentators describe Aboriginal time as circular or cyclical, on the basis that if time is not linear, it must somehow be circular. Swain points out that many false interpretations of words and concepts by anthropologists in grappling with a culture with no writing, with no counting, and with a hugely complex oral and spatial communication are not surprising. The incoming and dominant culture completely failed to engage. Swain's best attempt at his definition of Aboriginal time is rhythmed events. There is certainly, as it were, cycles, but they're not repeated cyclical cycles. They're rhythmic rather than cyclical. Carter shows that Aborigines, though not physically invisible to the invaders, were culturally invisible, eluding the cause and effect of white historical method and logic, not fitting into the imposed panoramic or theatrical gaze of colonial history. Their uniquely spatial experience becomes drained of meaning by a ritual of chronology, of naming, of ordering. Since Aborigines do not do this, they are deemed to have no right to possess the space and the land. Since Aborigines do not share this ordering, these boundaries, these contracts, thus the colonists' possession could go ahead without consultation. So a complete crossover, a complete mismatch of the cultures. Carter argues that as well as the territorial convenience of excluding Aborigines, there is an epistemological reason for their omission from white history and white space, and that is language. The colonizers failed to learn Aboriginal languages and failed to achieve any shared culture. They simply imposed a universalizing, categorizing control. White history manages to exclude Aborigines, but spatially, Aborigines remain dominant, and this is a great problem for the colonizers. Without them, much of the early settlement, without the Aborigines, much of the early settlement would have been impossible, and the colony might well have failed. They needed them, but in some ways they couldn't see them, and certainly couldn't open up any sort of dialogue or discussion with them. Whites comprehend the space differently and wish to suppress the nomadic spatiality of Aborigines. A lot of the early writing by the colonizers worries about this nomadic nature. You can't fix these people down. These people are, they appear suddenly and then they're gone. And this is very disturbing to the colonists. They want to know where they are and how they relate to the land. The colonizing culture begins to attempt to suppress the nomadic spatiality, and Aborigines slowly become trapped in white spatiality. Aboriginal space collapses as whites appropriate the same physical places, but with no valuing of their spatial significance. Aboriginal history, if there is such a thing, is non-linear. It's continuous. It happens through storytelling, through songs, through dance, through drawing and painting, all enacted through space. Travelling a territory is to tell it, or to sing it, or to draw it, to represent it to oneself. Deleuze and Guattari, in their Anti-Oedipe in 1972, in dealing with a different Aboriginal culture, defined this spatial writing, as they call it, in the words non-writing, as geographisme, geography in its pure sense, the writing of space. For them, oral cultures possess systems of so-called writing which are independent of the voice, coordinated with a multidimensional structure of dance, painting, travelling. Non-oral writing cultures, in other words, cultures like ours, lose the independence and multivalence of such other writings. Linear writing supplants the voice and introduces a fictional voice. And it is this fictional voice which is the voice of white histories. It can tell its story anywhere, anytime, to anyone. Aboriginal histories, in contrast, are symbolic, poetic, and fundamentally spatial. They are grounded, as it were. This non-correlation between the two cultures' ontology, spatiology, ownership concepts, creates many problems, including ethical ones. Specifically in land rights cases, in claims for customary title, for native title, the question of how do you measure the evidence? How do you assess Aboriginality? Who are you to believe? It's not a single story. There is no clear story that any colonial structure of law can use as evidence. The material is not accessible. Who can judge? And on what basis can you judge? So you can begin to imagine the difficulties as a well-meaning legislator, to some extent, moves towards trying to negotiate, that they realize that the language they have for negotiation is unworkable. Now I'm going to show a few examples of paintings, of ground markings, of dancers, and of other interventions into space, which I hope will try to hint at the quality of spatial relations that I've been trying to discuss more abstractly. Paintings, for example, are not art until their recent commodification, and you may have seen there was an exhibition in the Hayward Gallery 2 years ago, Arachara, which looked at Aboriginal art, so-called, and there was a big fuss about that. These are primarily not art objects. They are, one could say, at different levels, firstly maps of physical territory, and I'll show you some paintings which are explicitly mapping. They're also representations of dreamings, the ever-fluid retelling of spiritual ancestors, of the shaping of the land, of the continuing spiritual values, which have spatiality, have continuous re-representation and reinterpretation. And they're also personal reassertions of the reciprocal possession between the human being and the space in territory. They need to be retold, to be reenacted all the time, to, as it were, keep that non-historical history alive. So let's move to some more images. Just a couple of images of the space again to give perhaps some sense that it's not so difficult in space of extraordinary physical power, perhaps to begin to enter into a sense of relationship to that space, which is more than measurable, more than, as it were, historically or legally judgeable. These spaces are often, even to the white eye, extremely beautiful and mysterious places. The scale and the power of the Earth and of the shaping of the Earth in this very, very old continent, much of which was underwater for a long time, does have a very powerful effect even on completely other people arriving there for the first time. This mountain, for example, it's not difficult to believe, probably has some important significance. The way that it catches the sun, and in fact in this case this is in Kulpi, which is up on the Great Escarpment in North Arnhem Land, where I camped for quite a long time with Aboriginal people. The space is extremely powerful and very sacred space. I mentioned Obiri Rock, which is something that annoys many Aboriginal groups now. This is the place that's been named as a World Heritage Site. In other words, it's been taken and sort of consumed by colonial culture now as a place of importance. This is the place where there are rock paintings which have been dated back to more than 40,000 years. In this case, paintings of barramundi, the fish that are typical of the area. Of hunting. They are hunting a great kangaroo. Now, those are, to Aboriginal people, there is no significance that some of those paintings are 40,000 years old. Others were done a few years ago and are done in a cycle. There's not some sense of not touching what is old and what is therefore venerable. There is a continuous re-performance of the importance of that space. And that's also done through dance and through other more ephemeral things. Whereas the rock paintings have remained, the actual process of the inhabiting of the space continues. These are dancers from the same area. And this is a tiwi from Bathurst Island, where the making of the body into, as it were, a new landscape is part of, in this case, a Pukamani ceremony, a ceremony that is about death, or about the seeing of the spirit into the next transformation. The marking on the ground is a very important aspect. As with most Aboriginal non-art, as it were, so-called art, this isn't done by single people. It isn't done by an artist. This is done by groups, and it's done as a collective repositioning in space. And you may realize that it's not surprising that some Western contemporary artists have picked up on the power of this type of imagery. And we sometimes see on the floors of our art galleries today circles of stones which have perhaps a different meaning in our culture. Dendra Glyphs are extremely important, the carving into trees of positioning of spiritual places. They're not, as it were, signposts in terms of the geography, they're signposts in terms of the power that relates to that place. And they grow, of course, with the tree and transform as the tree transforms. Now, these paintings we could come closer to as thinking of as art, but these ones, in fact, are not art. These are done in the 1940s and 1950s, in this case up on the Blythe River, an area which is still, in fact, largely untouched by missionaries or Europeans. And this is a fish trap and also a totemic story of Bulan Bulan. Bulan Bulan was one of the great painters in that area. This is a very difficult piece. It's also not a piece of art. It's in fact but done by a woman called Teresina Moncada up in Bathurst. She's a Tiwi, and it's her moiety dreaming. And I won't go into this now, but tomorrow we can discuss it. White anthropologists use different terms to discuss allegiances within tribal systems, and this is one of her dreamings of the power of her moiety and how it relates to others. These pictures, however, are more problematic. These are acrylic paints on large canvases, and in a way they are commodified as art. You can buy one of these in an art gallery not far from here. However, these are also dreamings. This one is the bush mango dreaming, the two travelling women dreaming, and the snake dreaming by Penny Napangati, done in 1989. Now, a lot of it is not interpreted, and a lot of it is can't be interpreted. It's sacred information. But in doing this painting for consumption, as it were, she edits some of her dreamings. She's allowed. She owns three dreamings. In other words, she participates in the continuing story of three dreamings. And on the bottom part of the painting, in fact, is her land. This is a waterhole and the windbreaks that are around it, and a soakaway that is part of one of the parts of her land. This is rock pools and a cave structure in the centre of her land, and this is the Mambo territory to the other side of her land. Running through the middle of the painting is the path of the dreaming of the two sisters, which is one of the stories that appears in many different Aboriginal tribal cultures. One of the things that fascinates anthropologists is that a lot of these stories, the rainbow serpent is another one, although those cultures have had no contact with each other throughout history directly, they share often the same cosmology and the same symbols. Through the middle is the path of the two sisters, and so we move from, as it were, the temporal to the spiritual. And three parts that are explained of the top dreamings are a dreaming on the left, which is the Mambo dreaming, a dreaming in the middle, which is where the two sisters start their fight, and that's why they start their journey. And on the right, the dreaming about two of the snakes who have a fight, and they, by having that fight, clear the ground and make a large plain outside Wiripilli, which is where she lives, and that large plain is there. So in a way that brings us back to the land and to the territory. She knows why that land is there, because that is where the snakes cleared the ground as they did their big fight. So what I'm trying to get at, these are not paintings, and they're not sort of simple codified symbolic representations. They have many different layers to them, many of which we will never get to understand. And it's very difficult to know how to approach this type of material. This is another dreaming from Arnhem Land. This is the kangaroo and shield people dreaming of by Timmy Japangadi in 1980. Where most of the details about it are restricted because it's a religious painting, though this version of it has been sold to an art gallery in Australia, and there are big problems with this. But here, this is water. This is a dry salt bed area, and water becomes immensely important, and the way that the water runs when there are storms is extremely significant. It marks the land, but it's also where water resides afterwards. So this is a mapping of one of the water courses that moves through. At the top, the circles that are standing alone are very significant trees in that part of the territory, and the yellow patches around are sand hills that those trees are in. But the other circles are campsites, and they're, as it were, valences, the way that the campsites can interconnect with other campsites in the nomadic movement through that territory. So in a way, it's a street map. It's a map of where the things are, but it's many other layers of meaning as well. This is a group from Kirikiri Creek in 1992 being asked to make a painting, and this becomes very problematic. An art dealer gave them a bit of canvas 7 meters long and said, instead of doing this on the ground, why don't you do it on a canvas for me and I'll give you some beer. And this becomes really very problematic, and there's now increasing argument about this within white Australian culture. And so here they are. These are people who, two of them are extremely senior and therefore have the rights to all of the dreamings of their culture. And this painting, which again is largely restricted to us, which is 7 meters long, tells of the dreaming of the fire dreaming of Jadiwonpa. Jadiwonpa is one of these snakes, and you can see that the snake is there through the middle of the dreaming, together with tracks, both kangaroo tracks and human tracks, and some of these symbols that can either be windbreaks or campsites or groups of people, as well as the circular symbols which recur in many paintings and can have many different meanings depending on where they are. This is, if you like, a more commercial, and this becomes very worrying. This is from Papunya, which is the area around Alice where the dot painting is done, which is probably, for most people who, if you say Aboriginal painting, they think of dot painting. This is, in fact, a five dreaming painting, which is made to sell and therefore has hidden meaning in it, by Nelson Jacamara, done in 1984, and now in the Australian National Gallery in Canberra. His country is near Vaughan Springs, and his country is the intersection of five major dreaming lines, and his tribe has been responsible, as it were, to negotiate that intersection throughout time. And because he's an elder, he has access to all of those dreamings, and he puts all the dreamings in the painting. I won't begin to try, I'm quite inadequate in trying to interpret it. The serpent is there, the water holes and the flying ant dreaming through the middle, which recurs in many of the Papunya paintings. The flying ant is a very important totemic figure. At the top you can see the flood bed of one of the water courses which only floods at certain times. So there is both geography, again, but also whole other layers of meaning. Tomorrow, if you like, in the seminar, I'll be bringing in other material, and we can go into much more detail of some of the interpretation of this material. This is the carving of a Pukamani pole, a bone coffin, as part of the ceremonies for death in the Tiwi people, which is done collectively, of course, and eventually produces a group of these coffins which stand around the grave site. And this is truly art, in that this is a protest piece produced for the bicentennial in 1988 by an Aboriginal group who were based at Ramanginin in Arnhem Land, where 43 artists worked together to produce 200 bone coffins, one for each year of invasion, and, as it were, gave that into the white culture, saying, this is how you consume art. Here is a piece of sculpture that we make for you, to demonstrate, as it were, our frustration at the way in which you use our art. And it's a very powerful piece, which is now absorbed into the National Gallery in Canberra as well, which is, as it were, neutralizing territory. Now, very briefly, in the last 10 minutes or so, I want to make a jump, and this is difficult. I want to jump into contemporary practice and into what an architect or someone who is working in contact with Aboriginal groups might have to think about, and what you might have to do in terms of ethical practice. This discontinuity reflects perhaps the huge gap that exists between the cultures. I don't think it can be bridged, but questions of ethical practice are particularly acute when you start to make these jumps. So what should architects or anyone intervening in space aim to do with current work in relation to this background? There are very few Aboriginal architects as well, trained through the white system and recently qualified, and they also, in a much more difficult way, are trying to address that question. In my opinion, there is no such thing as ethical architecture. There can be, however, an ethical practice of architecture or of any other intervention into space. Except for a few independent tribal groups in remote areas who continue their nomadic use of space, many Aborigines live now as marginalised appendages to Australian settlements, either in mission stations. In this type of place, this is Tumala, it's a Department of Aboriginal Affairs fringe settlement on a white town in northern New South Wales. I know about this because it was subject of a United Nations Commission on Human Rights. They were taken to the international courts for the atrocious conditions that these people were living in, where there were actually epidemics of cholera because of the lack of sanitation, and they were actually brought to book slightly through white law in the relation of these people, where the standing water, it's particularly cruel because the water course that fed this area was dammed in order to provide water for the town, thereby killing both the supply of water but also the fish that had been the traditional source for these people. So clearly that's problematic. The other manifestation of Aboriginal people in Australian culture today is even more difficult. It's the urban ghettos and the increasing homeless Aboriginal wandering disoriented on the streets of the bigger cities. Now, one response is, as it were, to try to go backwards, though it's not really going backwards. This is a response by Peter Myers, a colleague of mine, who has worked with the Ramburunga people and other tribes around Maningrida in the Northern Territories for a long time, and is a form of protest. These are photographs done by Gibbs in 1895 of traditional bark shelter. These are shelters very quickly erected. These are nomadic people. They don't have houses. They move, and wherever they settle, they quickly make a shelter. They interact with the territory. They consume what they need from it, and they move on to allow the territory to revive and restore itself. And so what Peter Myers and others have done there as a form of protest, but also as a sort of cultural exploration, is to reject those Department of Aboriginal Affairs bungalows that we've just seen, which are pretty well uninhabitable in the climatic conditions of tropical Northern Territory, and to rediscover the making of these bark shelters, which can be translated in the local language either as shades, but also in a more spiritual sense as shadows. The word for it within that tribe is that you have, as it were, your shadow with you wherever you go. So it's not shade in the sense of shading you from the elements. These quick, very light shelters have now become extremely popular in the area. They cost about $100 in materials rather than thousands of dollars, though they're not accepted, quite understandably, within the Department of Aboriginal Affairs government office program from Canberra, who find them deeply offensive as being somehow a return to the native and therefore dangerous. Another response, which is not really very visible, and I haven't got a good image of it here, but tomorrow on the film you'll be able to see more what Paul Ferreras is doing with a team of other people in the Central Desert mostly. This is just outside Alice Springs. He and his team, which includes medical experts, link the question of housing, so-called, and of settlement fundamentally to health. And that's health, both physical and mental. One of the reasons that Aboriginal people die very young is not just that they are ill or that they are subject to alcoholism and drug abuse, but there is increasing discussion that it's also to do, as it were, with a loss of their ontology. They die because they don't know where they are. What Paul Ferreras and others do is simply to respond to the ecological and physical need of settlement within the area where the people are already settled. And they intervene about sanitation, about a response to climate, and they use very simple techniques, very simple shelters made of robust materials, and they do nothing more. That's the very clear position they take. They walk away once they've done that. And this, to me, seems to be quite an important breakthrough. They, in the past 15 years, have made a huge change in the health and the autonomy of those Central Desert groups. So within just 15 years of that program, they have radically transformed the physical condition that those people are in. A more conventional and very effective program is being developed called Housing on Aboriginal Land by Colin James in northern New South Wales, who persuaded the Department of Housing there to divert the bungalow money into a flexible housing kit. And this is just a couple of, which is a very simple constructional form where there is no conditioned space, and each family can, and indeed are beginning now, to modify and adapt and develop that. So it's a very simple idea to try to transfer the choice about how you might use a white house to people with the technology to do it under their own terms. In urban conditions, it's much more difficult, and that's where mostly I have worked in central Sydney with Colin James and a group of other people there on the first housing cooperative in Australia, the Aboriginal Housing Company, which was set up in 1973, just as the legal challenges of land rights began to take off. The cooperative has developed a program of upgrading. This is one of the big demonstrations in the centre of Sydney as that process of claiming land rights begins. The Aboriginal flag there. This is the actual space that we work in there, which is about 30 minutes or 25 minutes walking to the downtown. You can see the central business district behind. So this is very significant political space. It's in the heart of the largest and most powerful city. What happened was that the cooperative set up this company and bought out the slum landlords, and have, over the past 15 years or so, developed a program of upgrading, of new building, and of strategic planning against tremendous local hostility, the inflexibility of government agencies, and serious internal conflicts. It's not an easy story. The properties, as you can see, were on their last legs. One of the first interventions was to upgrade properties for housing, but also, very importantly, to introduce other activities into the area. This is a school. It looks like a bunker, and this is because of the tremendously violent protest by local white people against the idea that Aboriginal people would live in the centre of Sydney, and so there was firebombing and many other problems that had to be dealt with. the local economy begins to take off, and this becomes the political centre on the east coast of Australia of the land rights movement, as well as the beginnings of some exploration of what, if you are an Aboriginal living in European housing in the centre of a European city, what might you want to do with that fairly rigid format of the row house. And so much of the work we've done there has been to actually question what is the house, what is the space of the house, what is the relation of the house to the outside space, because these are understandably fundamentally different for nomadic people. And we've made some progress there, but the progress goes up and down. This foothold is in the heart of Sydney and therefore of great political importance. It remains, I'm afraid, today a place with great physical and social problems. Many of the residents, in spite of the upgrading of buildings and the building of new housing, this is the first of the new housing built about 8 years ago now, which is weathering pretty well given the conditions. Many of the residents now are exhausted by this battle and are considering moving out of this contested space. Although, as it were, they won the battle, they're exhausted by the continuous fight to be there, though other Aboriginal believe it's extremely important that they remain there. And finally, an example which is not domestic, and which I think, if one's dealing with questions of ethical practice, is perhaps the clearest. And this is, whereas most non-domestic building for Aboriginal communities is deeply patronising and ineffective, except for a few of the schools that have been built. This building, which is in the Bathurst Island, which is the Tiwi territory, right up at the top of Australia, almost on the equator, north of Darwin. And the Tiwi lost their keeping place. The keeping place is where a lot of the totemic objects, which can't be seen by different moieties or by different levels of initiation, have to be kept out of sight and can only be introduced at certain times into the ceremonial life. And they lost it. There was a great cyclone in the early 80s that knocked out most of Darwin and ripped off most of the land surface of Bathurst Island. And so they asked Peter Myers, who had been working with them there on intervention into the housing questions there, whether he could make them, as it were, a cyclone-proof bit of space. So this is not to be, as it were, a piece of architecture. It's to be a place which won't blow away when the next cyclone comes. And Peter Myers, having worked with these people for a long time, knew that what was important to them is the inhabitation of the space. So he builds an extremely simple steel frame structure which is bolted down into the ground so it won't blow away, and which has a barrel vault, the inside of the barrel vault being made of marine ply. And then he walks away. He leaves it in its, as it were, unfinished state. And the Tiwi, over the last few years, have done an extraordinary thing inside, and I was allowed to go in to part of the building to see a bit of what has been done. So the building becomes no longer a simple shell. It has no significance in its materiality, but it has, as I think you can see, tremendous resonance in terms of an understanding of space, of culture, and of the making of what I've been trying to sort of open up for you, the idea that spatiality is something not negotiable and not, to some extent, understandable by us. these small interventions I've just shown you, I think, might be called ethical practice. They represent a very slight shift in the ideas of Australian culture, and they must be weighed in the balance against the continuing doubtful practices of mining operations, of the tourist industry, and of other huge interventions into Aboriginal space. One must be wary of moralising and of nostalgia, and it is very difficult material to deal with. The ethics of intervention and change in Australia is not a clear-cut or a resolvable issue. The gap is too great, the past 200 years too difficult. The concept of reconciliation is popular today amongst Australian and Aboriginal reformers, but it has many aspects to it. The ethics of contemporary Australia applied to a policy of reconciliation may turn out to be useful, but the cultures are very different and can never be smoothly reconciled. There is a flourishing and regenerative Aboriginal culture, and at present an Australian government resistant, fiercely resistant to any change. Ethics and intervention in Australia will continue to be unresolved for a very long time. Thank you. It's 10 past, so we've got a few minutes if people want to. No, I think I probably knocked people out.
It kind of felt that there was, you describe two cultures, as it were, who even had the colonial occupation been of a kind of more benign character, nonetheless represent fundamentally different and opposed kind of conceptions of the land, etc. In terms of what you call the kind of process of reconciliation, what sort of kind of demands are being articulated in terms of kind of that? Is it a question that part of the solution would be the reservation of land, or what?
Yes. Well, it's very problematic. Part of the solution in terms of dealing with the white invasion of land is to do with claiming and reserving land, and significant bits of land that mining companies don't want in the central areas has now been designated as Aboriginal land, and we can't go in there without a visa. It is actually, and sacred sites, Uluru, which I showed a picture of Ayers Rock, which is probably the only thing that most people know about Australia, is now an Aboriginal site, and you cannot go onto it. You cannot go near it. You can see it from a distance. So there have been those sorts of territorial things. But, of course, this is a minefield. Inside Aboriginal culture, there are many different interpretations of what is owned by who, of who has rights to different things. And as you may know in the North American Indian case, tremendously vexatious disputes about claims to Aboriginality, as it were, about if you're claiming territory, for example, that might have uranium underneath it now, how do you, as it were, define your rights to that space as opposed to Rio Tinto zinc? And so within the culture, there's a terrible case going on at the moment at Hindmarsh Island, for example, where some women from an Aboriginal group, this is up on the west coast, said that the attempted turning of it into a holiday resort should not go ahead, making a bridge and putting chalets all over it and so on, because it was sacred land. And the judge in the hearing said, well, in order for us to test this, you have to tell us the sacred secrets that would make us believe it was sacred land. They said, well, we can't do that because they're sacred secrets. And so in the end they negotiated that they could tell a white woman lawyer some of them in order to, as it were, validate their claim. And they did so, and the claim went to the High Court and was being proceeded with when another lot of Aboriginal people came and said, no, those people are telling you the wrong dreamings. And so you can see the impossibility of trying to be on firm ground even if one is trying to take an ethical position. It is deeply contested at all levels. And there are huge amounts of money at stake from the white side in terms of uranium mining, gold mining, and other things.
I suppose the one thing might be certain of is like it was John Paul Getty who said, the meek may inherit the earth, but they're sure as hell not going to get the mineral rights.
I'm afraid so.
Okay, so I hope that those of you who can will read